It's time for the Maximum PC No BS podcast, episode 226 for the week of June 18th, 2014. On today's show, we have a very special guest from AMD in graphics guru Richard Huddy. So we'll be picking his brain for the majority of this podcast. That and much more is coming up right now. Thanks for listening. I'm your host, Jimmy Thang, and joining me as usual are Editor-in-Chief Gordon Maung.
Hello.
Associate Editor Tom McNamara.
Greetings.
And I stated at the top of the show, we have special AMD guests. We have Ansal sitting right here.
Hi, everyone.
And we have Richard Huddy sitting right in front of me.
Hey, Jimmy. Thank you for inviting me in.
Yeah, no problem. And sort of probably off camera, we have Connor. And so yeah, I mean, I know you, for those that are unfamiliar with Richard sort of worked a little bit, of everywhere. He's been at AMD, Nvidia, Intel. Now he's back at AMD. He's known as being one of the pioneers of DirectX. So Richard, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, you've got the history rather nicely there. I moved into 3D graphics with software rendering back in the mid-1990s. I'm sure all your readers and listeners know those years well. I worked on something that became Criterion Software's Renderware. I worked for Rendermorphics, which became the foundation of DirectX and Direct3D. And then I moved into 3D graphics, and as you say, I've spent a lot of time with the main vendors here. It's very interesting change. When I started in hardware 3D graphics, there were probably 20 players out there. These days, there's basically AMD, Nvidia, and Intel. These are the folks in the PC marketplace.
What would you account for the contraction?
Competition weeds out the weak, unfortunately, and if you're one of the weak, then you go the way of the dinosaurs. You don't last forever in this industry, and in fact, if you point at these three, they don't have an eternal future ahead. But in the early days, there was a lot of innovation. People were coming up with their own private APIs, their own private pieces of hardware that worked in fundamentally different ways. These days, under the aegis of Microsoft, I guess, we've got DirectX, and we also have OpenGL outside. But on the PC space, DirectX is the primary place for playing games, and that means that the core design of graphics hardware is pretty much the same across the three vendors. They're very, very closely related, and we have this kind of unification of the field instead of the splitting that we had before.
I guess my other question is, do you think we're to the point where, because you always get these fantasies of somebody starting up a graphics company, that's just gone. Those days, that's never going to happen again. And there's just too.
It seems like there's a much higher barrier to entry.
Right.
Absolutely. So it's typical with industries that when they become mature, the barriers to entry go up. Absolutely, it's a kind of policy for the incumbents in the business. If you go back 15 years, then you could imagine that with a smart bit of IP, you might be able to compete in that business. There were little companies like the Bit Boys out in Finland and so on. These days, I think it's unimaginable that you'd do that. The cost of building a modern GPU, anywhere from $300 million to $1 billion. It's a really big investment to design that from the ground up. So pretty tough to do it in your garage, I'm afraid.
Although, are we seeing a little bit of a disruption in handhelds? Because there you sort of have, these marginal graphics vendors kind of pushing out the greatest graphics parts. And there's definitely more than, a handful.
There is more than a handful, and they're competing in a different kind of way. What's happening with the handheld market? If you look at the introduction this year of OpenGLES 3.1, for example, it's strictly a subset of DirectX 11. So in theory, we've had hardware that can do all of that on the PC space since about 2009. But people are clearly focusing on that key subset. And again, there's not a great deal of diversity. It's not like someone's coming in with wacky vector renderers or anything like that.
Although that brings up another question, since you're the AMD guys here, but should AMD have stayed in handheld graphics? I mean, AMD was actually early on very much into it with the television graphics, of course, and then the division got sold off to Qualcomm, I believe. Do do you guys sometimes have remorse that you sold that division off? Or you're like, whoa, who wants to play there? That's no fun going up against Qualcomm and those other guys.
I think it's an interesting place to play. There is a part of me which feels remorse, but there's also a part of me that understands that actually what ATI was doing when it was making that investment in what became Adreno, which is an anagram of Radeon, which is why these two are so named. What was being done there was a little bit ahead of its time, and the market wasn't quite ready for it.
Right.
We saw that in a handful of years across maybe 2004 to 2007, 8, 9, that kind of period, when people tried to take 3D graphics into handhelds, and the power budget just isn't available for the kind of things you could build at that time.
Right, and I guess, Nvidia hasn't had the best success in handhelds. I mean, I don't know what the numbers are these days, but they're definitely pushing Tegra, but they're not really winning any battles with everybody else.
It's a tough place to win. The expertise that you have in the PC high end is great for designing the chips, but the criteria by which you win or lose are different. In high end graphics, we're able to produce an awesome beast that uses 570 watts of power, something absolutely insane for folks in the handheld space. They're looking at maybe 500 milliwatts. Yeah, it's quite a substantial difference. We can produce something which is a $1,500 beast like that. In handheld, you're absolutely tied to a power budget. If you can't get in the 200 or 500 milliwatt range, then you might as well not bother competing. And I think that's the biggest problem that Nvidia are having. Although they can clearly build a good graphics chip, building one at that kind of power budget is very, very tough. And you need other things as well, things like the radio and so on, which are not necessarily skills you have just because you know how to do 3D graphics.
So it sounds like the smaller GPUs can actually be more difficult to design than the larger ones for desktops that are more complex.
So yeah, when we build a desktop GPU, we can build something which is almost just pure GPU. It needs memory interfaces and PCI Express interfaces, things like that, say. But when you build a small GPU in a phone, it's one component of a highly integrated SoC. And if you fail on that integration, then you can't build a chip that's competitive on price. And if you fail on integration, then you're probably using up too much power as well.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, so I take it that AMD is not planning on releasing a mobile SoC.
It's not what we're looking at right at the moment. We've just introduced a couple of products which are viable for tablets, but the pursuit of the phone market is not something that we're interested in right now.
I just want to swing it back to things that actually matter, which are PC graphics. I don't know how this got into our readers always get pissed whenever we're swinging to mobile graphics and mobile discussions because they're fairly meaningless.
You're the one who
we do
you're the one who brought it.
We do tend to ramble around.
We like to ramble about, but so 295X2, you guys are recognized the king of the world right now, I guess. I mean,
I think if you do a review, you will find the 295X2 is the fastest graphics card on the planet.
Right, we have done the review, and
we give it a 9 kick-ass, which is one of the highest scores, if not the highest score we've ever given to a graphics card.
So I guess the question is, though, I mean, the 295X2, awesome card. Obviously, NVIDIA doesn't have a real response except for sort of a niche kind of uses in micro towers, that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. But do you think you can actually tame that power to where you can get, are you guys going to get to the point where you can tame that power and get it into without a package that you don't have to use a CLC just to make it run?
Absolutely. Not a doubt about it. The way the industry works, I think my favorite illustration of this is that the first time I ever came out to the US was in 1992 when I went to SIGGRAPH. And there was a company there that, again, people have not heard of too much these days called SGI. And they had a box which was, I don't know, half the size of this table. It was $1 million, and it had 8 LEDs on the front. 8, count them. It's a lot of LEDs. And they would light up as this beast generated more and more horsepower. It was a phenomenal thing. It could do, I know it's hard to believe, but it could do about 1 million triangles a second. It was just colossal. These days we can build that absolutely into a mobile phone. Not the slightest bit of difficulty building something like that. In fact, mobile phones are typically maybe 10 or 100 times more powerful on the smartphone end. So there's no doubt that we will take the horsepower of a 295X2 and build it into something which will fit in the palm of your hand without scorching the skin and so on in a handful of years. But the point is there is always this spectrum of capability that we can build. And right now, it's very clear that in PC gaming, people are willing to spend to get the ultimate gaming rig, the kind of dream machine that you guys put together, people are willing to spend a decent amount of money on that, and we can give them something which is absolutely astounding by modern standards. And in 10 years' time, people will say, what was the fuss about?
Right.
But it's awesome today, absolutely awesome.
Speaking of the Hawaii GPUs, are you happy with where True Audio and Mantle are right now?
I would like us to invest more in getting True Audio into games. I admit that. Yeah, we could do a better job, though. I think Thief is pretty good with that. Mantle, are we happy with it? No, I don't think so. I think we're delighted with it. It's astonishing. The number of developers who have signed up to Mantle, we talk publicly about this at the moment. We have, I think, 7 developers who we have named who are out in the open who are doing development, but we have 40 other developers in the closed beta program, which we started on May the 1st. And that's because games developers love this opportunity to have real low-level access to the hardware, to the horsepower in the machine. In 2009, Microsoft, this is such a good illustration of how Mantle has been extraordinarily well adopted. In 2009, Microsoft introduced DX11. Really nice API, huge cleanup of what was going on, great new features, love tessellation, love the kind of capabilities of the hardware, wonderful exposure of compute, great API, and in only 1 year, they had 9 DX11 games. And that's no small achievement. Just because it's 9, well, that's not a terribly big number. Heck, I've got more fingers than that, haven't I? But 9 is actually no small achievement when it comes to getting high-end games developers to pick up a new API that they haven't worked with before. We'll have more than that in the first year of Mantle. Yeah. So Microsoft, who own the PC platform, got 9 developers to release games in year 1 of DX9. We will have somewhere between 9 and 12, I believe, games that will be published. And we have 9 committed now, publicly committed, for 2014. So astonishingly, AMD with Mantle has more throughput, if you like, in terms of games developers shipping games in that first year than Microsoft had with DX11.
So what game or games do you think will show off Mantle the best within the next 12 to 18 months?
Well, I can't talk about anything that hasn't been announced.
Well, publicly announced, yeah.
Thief is a very good implementation of it. There are 1 or 2 issues with Battlefield 4, though for me personally, Battlefield 4 is still the tour de force of PC games design and games architecture. It's an absolutely superb piece of technology. And I'd swear to you, I do not say this simply because they were our first Mantle partner. They're actually our first Mantle partner because the kind of conversations that I was having with Johan Anderson 3 and 4 years ago led to Mantle. So I was at AMD at the time, and I was in those early conversations before we ever had a Mantle code word. And you could see from working with this guy that he can do amazing things with a PC. For me, it's still the case that the Frostbite engine is the ultimate engine, but it's going to be used in lots of places. EA have the good sense to understand that if they own a superb engine in-house, which is beautifully flexible, then they can take some of their key franchises like Need for Speed and Dragon Age and so on, and they can build that upon the engine. Well, that's extremely good news for those of us on the Mantle side of the fence as well, because it means that all of the games that use Frostbite will automatically have access to Mantle. So we will see things like the new Dragon Age coming, which will have Mantle support in 2014.
Also, let's not forget, for example, CryEngine and how Cloud Imperium is going to build or is building Star Citizen around that engine, and I think it's going to be a very, very anticipated title.
Oh, yeah. I think they have like $45 million in crowdfunding.
Crowdfunding
now.
is absolutely crazy, and Chris Roberts went out to say, I want to melt GPUs. I want to melt the GPUs inside your system.
Yeah. I talked to him at this past E3, and he's basically designing, because the game is so far out there still, he's designing it to take advantage of high-end hardware now, thinking that that's going to be pretty standard stuff by the time the game comes out.
Yeah, we've seen Crysis 1, 2, and 3 push on PC hardware in dramatic ways, and having that ported to Mantle, because of course Crytek have indeed announced that, as Antel says, having that available to games developers who want to use that exceedingly potent engine, that's great news as well. Yeah.
So I have a quick question. Why do you think developers have to embrace Mantle? Is it Microsoft has really not serviced DirectX 11 very well, and it hasn't serviced PC games that well either. So
Yeah, Microsoft's focus has clearly moved away from gaming and into other areas. They've most certainly wanted to deal with the tablet revolution that's come at them, and that's been a big focus for their attention. And as a business, of course, they're entitled to focus on what they want to choose. There's no implied criticism for me in that. But as a graphics guy, I absolutely want the games developers to have the opportunity of doing the very best on the platform, and that's clearly what the majority of games developers are telling us as well when it comes to Mantle. I would say that something like a third of the Mantle developers are using it these days. They've signed up to that closed beta. They're using it these days because it's going to be a great stepping stone to DX12 for late 2015. But the majority are telling us they want it to live well beyond DX12. It's an opportunity to get the very best. Yeah, quite simply, flatly, the very best out of AMD hardware. And actually, we're going to open up a standard around Mantle, which we might want to talk about a little bit. But for the games developers who have picked it up, those who have announced this year, they know that there is anything up to a 40% improvement. We've seen that in the first game that came out with Battlefield 4. And if your emphasis is purely on gameplay, and maybe cutesy stuff like Cut the Rope or Angry Birds, then you don't need Mantle whatsoever. Yeah, it's only a distraction for you, and I wouldn't try and push it down your throat as a games developer. But if your focus is on differentiating with graphics as well, and that's the case for many, many high-end PC developers, then this is a fantastic opportunity. And differentiation is the big business here. Yeah, it's not about being the same as someone else and just selling it for 10 cents less or anything like that. It's being demonstrably better. And Mantle gives you that chance.
But if you did talk about opening it up. That is, of course, the big issue. Is APIs generally in PC industry go nowhere without broad industry support. I mean, Glide was it took off amazingly, but it crashed pretty quickly once Microsoft got in the game on DirectX.
Yep.
Without Intel and without Nvidia board, can Mantle really go anywhere?
So Intel and Nvidia can get on board. There is a public statement from AMD that we're going to stick to, that we will open up this API as a standard, and we will absolutely, without license fee or any restriction, we will allow those vendors to come in and build Mantle drivers, which would mean that they could simply get hold of the extra performance that is available from running Thief or Battlefield 4 or any of the other games on Mantle. That'd be cool. But I'm losing the thread there.
Opening things up, getting those guys to. I mean, they generally, of course, nobody ever trusts anybody in this business, right? So
yeah, there's a lot of that. So the reason it will gain traction is because the market is very different from when Glide was around. When Glide was around, there were perhaps 15 players still left in 3D graphics. And when you thought about just servicing 3DFX, you realized that you were excluding maybe 70% of the audience of games players, certainly well over 50%. There were lots of players around. So it didn't make good sense to focus on Glide only. Now with Mantle, we're not saying do Mantle only and don't do DirectX. I think it's fair to say in retrospect that 3DFX were actually encouraging people to do Glide only and to drop the DX version.
Yeah, that's fair.
We're not doing that, absolutely not. We would encourage any games developer to simply put this in as an API layer in the way that most games developers do, so that they can program for PS4, for Xbox One, for PC, for any of the platforms that they want to consider. And they will have a Mantle layer as well, and it will typically take 4 to 6 weeks, maybe 8 weeks of programmer time to do. Clearly it's taken the earlier developers longer as they've worked with an unstable driver and we've tried to build stuff. But the cost is quite low and the gain is quite high. On top of which, for us at AMD, one of the big wins here is that we own our own future when we own Mantle. We have been restricted with the cadence of Microsoft with DX11 in 2009, waiting for DX12 in 2015. 6 years is too long as a graphics guy. We can build new graphics chips which are interesting and have new capabilities. And the games developers who are after visual differentiation will be able to take advantage of that. And they know that 35–40% of games players are actually using Mantle-capable hardware.
Do you think that Microsoft would have even announced that they were doing DirectX 12 if you guys didn't move forward with Mantle? Because up to then, I thought they said, we don't know what we're doing. So
I suspect they didn't actually say we don't know what we're doing, but but they were clearly struggling with exactly what the right step was and what the right kind of timing was. It isn't obvious to me whether they would have done DX12, but I absolutely think that we helped the industry move forward with what we did with Mantle, and we most certainly did so in a constructive way. We shared what we were learning in the process. with Microsoft and other ISVs too. I used to say when I used to work in the ISV group at AMD that DX11 was really great, but you could never really nail down what the problem with it was. If you got Microsoft, an ISV, and a hardware vendor, so you got a games developer, Microsoft, and say us, if you get any two of those into a room, they'll always blame the one that's missing for the problem. They will always say, it's them, it's them. That's where the issue is.
We do that at work, so when Tom leaves, we blame everything on Tom.
Yeah.
So here at work, the three of you suddenly come into one room and you have to sort it out. But there was some kind of magical thing that happened when you tried to get Microsoft, the games developer, and the hardware vendor into the room, and they wouldn't be there. It was like Clark Kent and Superman. You couldn't do it. So what happened was, 4 years ago or so, we started these conversations with ISVs about what we could do to remove the artificial brakes that the operating system and DX collectively were enforcing there. And because we know our hardware close to perfectly, and the ISVs involved know what they wanted to achieve and knew what they could achieve on consoles, we're able to break through those barriers. And we showed that to Microsoft, and Microsoft learned from it and built upon it with DX12. I don't know whether they would have done it without us. I suspect they probably would, because they've been ambitious about it. I used to talk in the days of the introduction of DX11 and DX10 too about the effort that was going into improving throughput. But if you actually want to point at a place in history where it was fixed, it would be Mantle. Yeah. And interestingly, the world changed then. In September 2013, there were no low-level APIs that matter. Now we have Mantle, which came along in October. You have DX12 announced at GDC this year in March 2014. And interestingly, just 2 or 3 weeks back, Apple announced their own low-level API, Metal, which is the same kind of philosophical approach to getting the best out of the hardware.
Very similar name, too.
Purely a coincidence. I can tell you it's not informed by conversation with them, but there is a trend there in the industry, and maybe they'll all have M's in or something like that. I guess that's not true of DX12, but never mind. I was close.
They could always rename it.
Yeah, and they all have vowels in. I have noticed that.
Doesn't it make it pretty hard for you guys, though? I mean, if there's just, you've got Metal, you're going to have Mantle, you've got DirectX,
there's OpenGL.
I mean, is it for developers and for hardware vendors? Does it make it a bit of a nightmare?
No, it's actually very simple. If you were trying to keep control of 30 APIs, like in the days if you go back to the mid-90s where you have many, many vendors, then it's tough. And the APIs are abstracted at radically different levels at that point. And hardware actually behaves in fundamentally different ways. These days we have a core of functionality which is kind of the OpenGL 4-ish or the OpenGL ES 3.1-ish spec or the DX11 spec. All that functionality is pretty well understood and is in common between the chips. And the software side, as I say, is a relatively small investment. You need smart people who know how rendering tech works. But typically something like 4 to 8 programmer weeks of time will solve this problem. And then you just have the layer sitting there, and you can take your game engine, you can take your code, and you can bring it onto those other platforms. It's a surprisingly small investment, actually, from a software developer's point of view.
Yeah, I will say I did interview some developers, and they said it was just a matter of a few hours to a couple days to implement Mantle support. So it didn't sound as bad as you think it would.
It's not hugely expensive, and I don't want to come in with a very, very conservative estimate that says you can do it in a couple of days and no one will ever be frightened about the cost. So it really depends how well abstracted you are. I think if you're a PC developer who's only ever shipped on PC and you've only ever done DX, then it'll be at the top end of that kind of range. But I would think that it's not too hard these days to get it lower. Yeah.
But I mean, but clearly you guys recognize if you really want Mantle to continue past 2015, past DirectX 12, you really have to get some support from Intel and Nvidia, or do you really think you can just continue to offer Mantle beyond 2015? Without
I believe that we can, and the reason I say that is because ISVs are telling us that right now, that they don't want us to give up Mantle. I said earlier, I think, that developers fall into, at least the developers who are enthusiastic about Mantle, fall into 2 groups. You have those who are using it as a stepping stone to DX12, and I'd estimate that that's about a third of the developers that we're working with. So if you take the number of 47 registered developers that we have now, that means that you'd say that there's something like 15 or 16 developers who will maybe jump ship when DX12 comes along. But the rest know that Mantle is beautifully tuned for this hardware. It is not a generic API, which is the kind of fundamental disadvantage of DirectX or OpenGL. It's not a generic API, and we will be able to not only expose things like the HSA capabilities of our silicon in future, so the heterogeneous programming interfaces that we've already built into to silicon, but the new graphics features, which are actually the opportunity to differentiate for a software developer. Anything that we come up with, we put it into the silicon, we talk to the ISV before it arrives. The day we start to sell that silicon is the day we can put out a Mantle driver that supports it, and of course we go through the beta process. The ISV who's interested in that and who's in the dialogue with us can potentially ship a game the day that ships, the day our hardware and our driver ships. And that's really, really exceptional. There's none of this waiting for the operating system vendor or for Kronos or something like that, where there is a huge QA burden for the entire ecosystem that gets involved. Instead, this is something that we can do through cooperation with the ISV and us, just two companies with a common aim, and that's easy to line up.
Okay.
That's right.
Well, otherwise, so sorry, I'm monopolizing the questions, but
That's cool.
you guys, I know you guys have made the public statement. What did Intel and Nvidia say?
Intel have asked us publicly if they can have access to it, so I've seen that dialogue going on, and our reply to that is at the moment this is a closed beta, but the API definition will be fully out there this year, and if they want, then they can give us feedback, and we will listen to the feedback. And if they want, they can start building the driver that day. And they can, of course, look at much of the documentation that's probably leaked around and actually start themselves off if they want to. I don't know what the conversation is with NVIDIA. My guess is that pride will stop them doing this, and I think that's a shame. The advantage for us is that this solves the problems that games developers care about. It gives games developers the chance to get the best out of our hardware. And that's not a matter of pride where you should say, oh, I don't want to do that. AMD came up with the idea. It's a matter of pride where you should say, my hardware is better. That's the kind of stuff you want in a competitive environment, which is constructive for games players. My hardware's better. I'm going to produce a better Mantle driver than AMD. I'd like to see them try. I think they could do a good job of it. I think it could be very competitive. It's a matter of whether they choose.
Right, but I mean, for those guys, you guys ultimately have control of it. I mean, this is a classic line we always hear with every API war, which is, well, we'll do it if they'll give up control by EEE or some other, rule by committee kind of thing. Is that something AMD's considered? Or does that just turn Mantle into, rule by committee and nothing happening for 3 years because people can't agree on the shape of the table we're meeting at?
Well, it'd slow things down, but I don't think that's the biggest concern for AMD. For AMD, the biggest concern is that Mantle has to expose all of the goodness of our hardware. So while 1.0, when it ships, will be fixed and solid in time and won't change, we'll go on to 2.0 and it'll expose things like, and I'm not being specific about features here, but things like HSA and any of the other graphics features that we introduce. But it will always remain tuned for the GCN architecture. Now, interestingly, GCN architecture is what I would call a wide scalar architecture. So we process thousands of pixels in parallel, typically in gangs of 64 or so in these compute units, and they're done as scalar operations per pixel. That's the simple high-level description of how our GPUs work. And curiously, if you describe NVIDIA's hardware, you get exactly the same description, which is why I think that they could produce a very efficient Mantle implementation to run on their hardware. Mantle is designed so that it could extend across those other pieces of hardware, and we'd love the other IHVs to participate. If they choose not to, then that's okay. But we need to keep it. We need to keep it because it will always expose the goodness in GCN. That's the AMD way of building GPUs. And importantly for us, it's not just about exposing things in the future, but it's about exposing across multiple operating systems. Right now, Mantle is only available on Windows, but we can take it to other places where we play. So there's a comment that's come out recently from me saying that it could go to Linux, it could go to the Steambox. Absolutely. It's just a matter of prioritization and getting consent from the platform holder. There isn't any technical value in taking it to something like a console, so putting it on Xbox One or PS4. I can't see any technical reason to do that. I can imagine slightly bizarre business reasons why we might get asked to, but essentially Mantle is a console-like interface. So taking a console-like interface and putting it on a console seems a bit dumb. You've already got one there. That's not the pressure from us. The pressure is reveal the goodness in the hardware wherever it might be. And for AMD, our hardware is going out into various places, and we want to make sure it can always be exposed in full goodness.
Well, it seems like it would benefit Intel quite a bit to have that access because their integrated graphics are pretty modest compared to a discrete GPU.
I think they could show substantial advantages too. Their architecture is less close to ours, to the GCN architecture, than Nvidia's is. Intel's architecture, they talk publicly about the fact that it's a vector execution unit that they have instead of the scalar execution that we have. But actually, I think that they could do a respectable job as well. And my belief is that they would show a gain in that situation, yeah.
Cool. Just transitioning to a slightly different topic.
Sure.
I do have to ask about this because it is sort of a big topic in the news recently. But it's that AMD recently said Nvidia's Gameworks represents a clear and present threat to gamers by deliberately crippling performance on AMD products to widen the margin in favor of Nvidia products. Nvidia has basically denied this. Where do we stand on this?
I believe we're very glad that you asked that question.
We are indeed willing to take this question on. Let me draw a contrast between where we've just been talking about Mantle and Gameworks. In Mantle, we're putting out a standard and inviting other people to join in, but they don't need to if they don't want to. There isn't anything that we can do in a Mantle app that could even conceivably harm Nvidia. Yeah, it's just impossible. A games developer could, so this is not us, a games developer could choose to produce a Mantle-only app. We haven't asked them to do so, and I don't know of any who are thinking of doing so. Yeah, there is no harm to Nvidia in Mantle. It is about improving the way that games developers are able to expose the benefits of hardware. It's just good stuff. Now, it costs them a little bit of effort, but it's just good stuff. Gameworks is rather different. Gameworks is supplied as DLLs. We all know what DLLs are, dynamic linked libraries. It's a piece of code which has already been compiled and which you can't change. That's how it's given to games developers. I've worked with games developers for, when did I start with 3D Labs? 1996. And ever since 1996 to date, I have never had a games developer ever ask me for a DLL for games code. They would never ask for that. They will always ask for source code. If you ask someone who's developing on the Epic engine, if they're building something for Unreal, say, building something which is based on the Unreal engine, they will always say that they would rather have as much source code as possible. And Nvidia are doing something which is quite different here. They're supplying DLLs. And the DLLs are black boxes. They're pieces of code written by Nvidia which deliver certain visual effects. Now, you can see that those visual effects are beneficial to the game in that they raise the quality of individual frames. Yeah, you can see the picture is different with that effect, and it may be beneficial, therefore, in that respect. But there is a question about how fast it runs. And for most hardware companies, we expect our graphics cards, for all graphics companies, we expect our graphics cards to be judged on the basis of games. Yeah, far better to judge on the basis of games than on a synthetic benchmark like 3D Mark. If you're selling a $20 or $50 graphics card, it's kind of okay to be judged by 3D Mark. If you're selling a $500 graphics card or a $250 or a $1,000 graphics card, you definitely want to be judged on the basis of games. And what this DLL does is it gives Nvidia the opportunity to write code. Follow this very carefully, if you will, with me. Nvidia can write code which goes into a game and is used to benchmark our hardware. Well, okay. If Nvidia are the good guys, and it's conceivable, yeah, let's not cross that out yet, not until I come up with some other evidence. If Nvidia are the good guys, then maybe it's all right for them to write code which benchmarks my hardware. Doesn't feel quite right. I'm a bit nervous about it, to say the least. But absolutely, it is the case with this DLL that they write the code, which is what's executed on AMD's hardware and is used for judging the quality of AMD hardware if you ever use a Gameworks title in your review of our hardware. Okay?
We should make a note of that.
So there's a philosophical concern, yeah? I can't write any code. I can't do it with Mantle. I can't write any code which will allow you to benchmark Nvidia hardware and show up any weakness in their hardware or anything like that. I can't do it. It's impossible.
Right. Although the parallel on the CPU side is, and this, AMD CPU side has always accused Intel of this, is, hey, you know what? The reason why we stink is you're running all the applications using it, they use the Intel compiler. Do you think Intel's going to go out and optimize for us?
So historically, we've certainly seen issues there, and I think that things have been cleaned up there.
Right, but I mean,
that's the case.
I think Intel's argument, I don't know what Nvidia said. I know they have denied any of this, but Intel has always classically said, well, why don't you just use the AMD compiler? Oh, right, they don't have one of those tools. So is it possible does that mean AMD should go to these developers and basically, write some of the code, do some of the developer
I'd love for us
outreach?
to be able to write some of the code. What happens in these contracts, there's quite a bit more of the story that needs filling in. What happens in the contracts is that NVIDIA signs a marketing deal with the software developer and gives them money to be able to co-market with that particular title. And one of the clauses in the contract is, and you shall use Gameworks in the released version. Another clause, which NVIDIA do not talk about and which they deny, is you shall not optimize this code with AMD. You may not show it to them, and you may not work it with them. Now, that's quite extraordinary, and I haven't seen the contract, but I've seen emails from ISVs which say, hey, we'd love to work with you guys, but we can't work on the Gameworks stuff. Or
Right.
I'd
love to see those emails.
I'd love to see the contracts.
Forward them to me.
Even anonymously, it would be interesting to see
So-
some of that.
Right, so here's a little bit of history. If you go back to Batman Arkham Asylum, we were seeing similar kind of tricks being played. There was a late build of Batman Arkham Asylum, which came into AMD as the game was about to be released. It was a handful of days, I think 3 days, but if you like, I can look up the exact details. And suddenly the game was dramatically different. We lost support for anti-aliasing, for example, which had been in before and which had been through the QA process. Now, NVIDIA publicly stated that they were not blocking AMD from optimizing that code. It was fine for us to be involved, much the same as you're hearing from them now. At that time, I did leak an email from one of the execs at the publishing company who said, sorry, we have a contract that prevents us from working with you on this. Please leave us alone. Now, you can take that as evidence that a leopard doesn't necessarily change its spots, and this one's got some very visible spots. Or if you like, you can just say, well, that was then and this is now. I'm sure they're the good guys now. It's possible. But I'll give you another piece of evidence which suggests that there is something malicious going on here. And that is that, for example, TressFX runs at about the same speed on AMD hardware as it does on Nvidia hardware. Nvidia have been able to optimize their driver, and they've done a good job. They've got it to the same execution time as us when they're running something like Lara Croft Tomb Raider. Okay, the hair simulation, which is run through TressFX, a piece of code that we supplied in source code form to the developer. It's now beautifully optimized, works at the same kind of speed on both pieces of hardware. However, what you see on Call of Duty Ghosts is something rather different. If you turn on Gameworks, you find that there's a piece of code in there that runs 7 times slower on AMD hardware than on Nvidia hardware, and it's hair simulation. It's the fur on the dog. Why are we running so slowly? Well, if you actually dig into what's going on, they're doing line tessellation, and they're doing line tessellation to a crazy extent. What they're doing is they're tessellating the hell out of the model so that it runs slower. And the really, really sad thing here is that you could argue about artistic quality. You could say, maybe you need to tessellate this. Maybe you need to break it up into sub-pixel triangles. But the quality difference is clearly just about zero when you're making these changes right at the high end of the levels of tessellation.
And it runs a little bit slower on NVIDIA as well.
It runs slower on NVIDIA hardware. They throw away some performance there. But because it's 7 times slower on AMD hardware, they are willing to encourage this use, and indeed they force it in the contract, so that we run significantly slower. It's something like a 40% burden for us when it's about a 5% burden for them. We are running code in a benchmark which is harming us, and this code has been written by NVIDIA, and their contract is stopping the ISV from changing it. This is not equitable.
Another great example was Crysis 2, when they actually were tessellating the water below the city, which was never visible to to anybody who was playing the game.
We saw some wireframe of that, and it was.
And then there were other objects in that game as well.
Yeah, and you can see what's happening here. Yeah, this is degrading the performance for players on NVIDIA hardware as well. But NVIDIA don't care about that because it hurts us more.
Sure.
Well, what about their games players? Shouldn't they actually pay attention to them?
I suppose, but then I guess another counter argument is you bring up Tomb Raider. Tomb Raider came out, turned on TressFX. It killed NVIDIA cards initially, right? Until it took them maybe a couple months to catch up and get TressFX to work right. And of course, they argued like, well, look, it's not our fault. This is an AMD game. We didn't have access to developers, so it's because of their contract with AMD. That's why you're suffering for the first few months.
Okay, so I would be happy to put that contract in front of you and let you see whether there is any such clause in the contract, because I do not believe there is any such clause in the contract. Yeah. Now, I would make that open.
Okay, so we'll see
I'm
that.
betting you money NVIDIA won't do that with these contracts.
Well, we're
yeah?
challenging NVIDIA now to let developers show us some of these Gameworks contracts, and you will show us the contracts for...
We'll match them and we'll win this argument. Yep.
It's fun.
It's pretty contentious. And the worst thing about this situation
Man,
is...
it's like the 90s. Isn't this awesome?
Yeah,
It's like the 90s. And the 90s were like the 70s. It was really awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
The bad thing about the situation is that a lot of people are having to make judgments without real information. I'm making these assertions, but I'm not in a position to prove stuff to you.
Right.
I can't show you some of the emails that I have because they're clearly covered by NDA, and the ISV is saying, I don't want to be dragged into this. The ISV should not be dragged into this. If there is a fight between AMD and NVIDIA over this stuff, using an ISV as the middleman, as a human shield or a target or something like that is just wretched. This is not in the interests of PC games players at all. It's wretched. And I'd like it to go away. And for that reason, we're asking for your support in encouraging this to come out in the open. If we have a contract war, let's bring the contracts out. Let's show them to you guys, and you can tell us if there's a clause which is restrictive in an AMD contract. I don't reckon we're going to find one.
Just for the sheer entertainment aspect of this, I'm glad you guys doubled down on that.
We're going to see this contract next to that contract. And
Yeah.
see what.
Cool. Looks like blood may be spilt somewhere along the way.
I think so,
So-
but it's going to be green blood. It's okay.
Yeah. So here's my question, though. So they were eventually able to optimize for Tress effects, so it actually did not turn out to be an issue.
It runs as
long
fast
term.
as it does on us.
Is
yeah.
there a way for AMD to fix this?
Superb, absolutely so. So one of the things is having this kind of fight in public and bringing out the situation that exists and making sure people understand it. The other thing is to see if we can find a way of changing the industry so that this kind of behavior no longer pays for anyone. Yeah. And that's why one of the things that AMD is looking at, and I want to put heavy emphasis on this, we're looking at it. It isn't the solution that we're going to put out. We're not certain of it yet. We haven't decided. But we are thinking about producing an OpenFX library. Yeah. So we would involve Kronos. We would give it to a group like Kronos, owned by ISVs, controlled by ISVs, run with the interests of ISVs, where we give all of the IP that is in our SDK, and we give it to that group, and we encourage other hardware vendors to do exactly the same thing. Then the source code for loads and loads of effects is freely available for games developers. They can optimize it for every single platform. No one ever has to say, oh, wait a minute, I've only got a DLL. Sorry, I can't fix it for your hardware. Yeah, all that stuff goes away. And just like the Linux community continues to develop a very stable, a quality operating system, then the effects community could do the same kind of thing. Yeah, there are lots of talented graphics programmers who would gain from this.
Yeah, it's my understanding that Linux drivers have lagged behind because they just don't have access to the stuff that's in the proprietary drivers, because the proprietary drivers have licensed code that you guys are not authorized to distribute to the open source community.
It's true, and I wasn't trying to compare our Linux driver. Yeah, I wasn't talking about Linux drivers. I was talking about Linux itself. So the Linux code base is managed by whoever each group is. I mean, there are several that do it. Some take their own code base and then own it for themselves and fix it, and some are genuinely public domain. And what I'm suggesting is that, like that operating system could be maintained by the hundreds of participants in the community, so could the code base that represents these various different effects be managed by games developers who care about it. Different from the driver stuff. Sorry if I confused that.
No, it's probably my confusion.
Well, and so I do have another question. So if I'm an ISV, I'm a developer, I sign this contract, I get X amount of support, X amount of marketing dollars from the green team.
Mm-hmm.
Why would I take on the support calls and complaints and heat from my customers?
That is a wonderful question.
So I mean, that's why it's a little hard for me to believe that a developer is going to eat all this grief.
It is,
unless the check is that big, and I have a hard time believing anybody's writing checks that big for that.
Well, how big would the check have to be? And then I'll.
Well, I mean, is it really? I mean, it's just hard to believe. It makes it a little.
I can tell you from personal experience at the number of companies that I've been at that these are multi-million-dollar deals frequently, and it's by no means rare for these deals to be $1 million plus.
Right.
Yeah.
And that makes it worth eating all the heartache and
well, I think when so there are two problems. One is you don't know what the heartache is.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I know how the PC community reacts to everything. So
Yeah, but you don't know in advance. When you sign a contract to take on Gameworks, or if you sign a contract with AMD to be in the Gaming Evolve program, then you don't know what grief is actually going to come to you. I think this has come as a pretty unpleasant surprise to those who have participated in the Gameworks process. And it's intended to be unpleasant from our side. We've got to make a fuss about it. We can't just let it go. There's too many people who are suffering. So part of it is not knowing up front. The other part of it is that games developers and publishers are a more complicated beast than just one person making one decision with one set of priorities. That's the real problem. You have a publisher which is driven by revenue.
Okay, bean counters, right?
Bean counters, if you will, but they're an important contributor to keeping this company going as well. And you have the technical guys who are the people that we on the geeky side of life think are they're our gods.
Right.
They're the guys who deserve to be in the right. And these people make different decisions. The technical guys work with the code base that they've got. They work with the engine they were given, if it's Unreal or Unity or whatever it might be, or their own code, and they work in that fixed set of circumstances. And they don't see the $1 million check or the $5 million check. $5 million would be a very, very big deal these days.
It's because they're not the publishers aren't passing that bonus on to developers.
They don't pass it straight down to developers. No, the bonus, I suspect, goes to the guy who signs the check.
Sure.
And here you can see where the problem is quite clearly. Yeah, the games developer is going to end up saddled with a potential problem, which might be a very large problem in terms of supporting PC gamers. But he's saddled with the problem because somebody else signed the deal, and the somebody else did it for good reasons. Hey, I brought in $1 million. What's the matter with you? What do you want me to do? That's my job, isn't it?
It's a technical decision being made by non-technical people.
It ends up being that, yeah.
So, I mean, but the only way you can fix it is to turn the heat up on this. I mean, that's...
Turning the heat up is one thing, and giving people another solution is another thing, and that's why we're looking at OpenFX, yeah.
That just takes a while for...
Sadly, it will take a while. The other thing that can be done to fix this is for you guys to look, dig into this stuff. Don't trust me and don't trust Nvidia. Look for your own evidence. Dig into things.
Sure.
If you find that a particular Gameworks effect is running and it's clearly taking 40% of our performance and 5% of Nvidia's performance, ask questions about just how good an idea that was. And if you see us doing something similar, go after us. Absolutely. Keep us honest. Yeah, you've got to do that. That's the way the world is. People aren't naturally honest all the time. We need pressure on us. But you should take... Suddenly I'm the man who's owning the questions on the microphone here. You guys have a responsibility to your readers to stand up for what is right. Do not stand on the sidelines. God, I sound passionate about this, and it's because I am. Every games player who gets deprived by this experience is being deprived of value from the money they've spent on a graphics card, and they made a perfectly reasonable decision. This is not a fair way to treat games players, yeah?
I agree, but I mean, I know in the other, this benchmarking war has gone on forever, and usually somebody raises a fuss and all the media just says, well, this game runs better on AMD or this game runs better Nvidia, and they just kind of sort of...
I guess it's not just about running better on one or the other.
Right. But I mean, I typically, it's sort of like the I don't know if, on the CPU side, there was a huge dust up over a Sysmark way back in the day. Both you guys and Nvidia walked away from it. Apple walked away from it as well. Because there were a lot of accusations that Intel was cooking everything, and basically what happened is just nobody ran the benchmark because it's like there's just too many accusations. Nobody could prove anything.
Well, if that's the result, that nobody runs synthetic benchmarks, then I think we've made progress, because I think synthetic benchmarks are a pretty rotten way to judge a quality piece of hardware, especially if you're looking at something which is $200 plus or something like that. You deserve a better metric. But on top of that, I would say I positively encourage the press whenever I meet them, and I'm happy to reinforce that now. Do not use benchmarks that we encourage you to use either.
Sure.
In our experience with games developers, what I try to do with games developers is I try to get them to build in a benchmarking capability, and that's not the same as build in a benchmark. I don't ask them, hey, can you just benchmark this so that it's a nice bit that flatters AMD hardware?
Right.
That's not what I do. What I ask them to do is make it possible for you guys to record your own benchmark. That way you can choose what's representative, not the IHV. You can choose it. And if you want to enable Gameworks because you think it's the best thing since sliced bread, then you do that. That's fine, But do so on the basis of careful judgment. And if you want to turn it off, I think you're doing the right thing, but make the choice.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fair.
I'm feeling terribly firm today.
Another interesting thing that happened this week in relation to PC games is a controversy surrounding Watch Dogs. And I'm not sure if you've been following the story at all, but apparently the allegation is that for whatever reason, it appears that Ubisoft has nerfed the way Watch Dog looks on PC. Allegedly. Yeah, we don't know for sure.
we don't.
I can see my PR managers looking nervously at me over this one.
Because I guess the story goes, there was a player who went into the .ini file and then tweaked some settings and got the game to look as good as it did at Watch Dogs E3 showing.
Like 2012,
yeah,
I think.
2012.
Yeah.
And so apparently it looks a lot better. There were no performance hits. So it's a very mysterious and bizarre story.
So if there are no performance hits, then it's quite a worrying story, yeah. But I would be surprised. Usually making something look better, genuinely better, costs you performance. I can imagine that this would be a QA issue with Ubisoft, so I'm really quite keen not to throw them under the bus on this. Maybe Watch Dogs was fairly late, yeah. I actually bought a copy for my son, and I bought it last year on Xbox 360 as it happens, but I pre-ordered it a year ahead, and it's late. It may well be that some of the code that they have shut out didn't satisfy their QA criteria. I don't know. I can think of that as an off-the-top-of-my-head explanation. But I have to say, I have not discussed this with Ubisoft. I've not discussed it with my ISV team. So I'm speculating from a position of considerable ignorance.
Well, we're just asking around, trying to piece it together, because Ubisoft is just denied that they've downgraded it, but they haven't really elaborated on what happened.
I've emailed them; they haven't responded.
Yeah, well, I guess it's up to you guys to try to find this out. I mean,
they've gone into blackout mode, so we just have to ask everybody else.
Well, I think so. If I go back to what I said about Nvidia's Gameworks earlier on, I think there are too many black boxes. Yeah. Let's have investigative journalism.
We should mention that Watch Dogs is an Nvidia aligned title as well. So
is it a Gameworks thing?
It is a Gameworks title.
It's all Gameworks' fault.
It's a Gameworks title, but to be fair to Nvidia, if I were picking out Gameworks titles which look like they're maliciously arranged to harm AMD hardware, I would not pick out Watch Dogs. I'd pick out Call of Duty Ghosts, and I'd pick out Batman Arkham Origins.
Well, I noticed when we were benchmarking Watch Dogs a couple weeks ago before this optimization thing hit, that it was using up all of the VRAM on a 290 or 290X right away, all 4 gigabytes.
Yeah. All of it on a 780 Ti as well. So that's 3 gigs and then 4 gigs on the AMD
when we
card.
put a Titan in there, I think it was only using like 3 or something, like 3 gigabytes. So that was kind of
I don't know
confusing.
if we ever tossed in a Titan.
No,
I know
we
it was a
didn't put the
780
Titan in.
Ti, I think, and it had 3 gigs, and it used up all of that. One thing that I'm hearing in relation to like the next gen consoles is that because the next gen consoles are using, I think, 8 gigs of unified RAM, developers are optimizing it for that, whereas most video cards today, even high-end PC cards, don't have that much VRAM.
Well, 295X2 has what, 8 gigs?
Well, it's mirrored.
It's 4 gigs per GPU.
It's 4 gigs per GPU. That is correct. Yes.
Right. So even a 780 Ti only has 3 gigs.
I think they just came out with a 6 gigabyte version. I saw one from Asus.
Right.
But let's be
recently,
clear on this. People are only interested in the world's fastest graphics card, and that's from AMD. All this 780 Ti and Titan stuff.
Yeah, even on the 290, it was using all 4
are you
gigs
saying what was the fastest video card out right now? What brand?
295AX2 from AMD.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're right about the 8 gig in consoles. If you tune for that, then you will find it difficult to hit PC platforms with different amounts of memory. I really don't want to draw any conclusions about anything that Ubisoft have done wrong with Watch Dogs yet. I think there's stuff worth looking into, but I don't think there's any reason with this shader stuff to believe that there's anything deliberately wrong. Absolutely.
Although
nothing there yet.
This is typical, right? Because you have basically some guy finds some switch that he switches on, and then the internet goes into conspiracy mode, and
that's a pretty unhappy discovery.
He wasn't even reverse engineering anything. He was just looking at configuration files, and he found some tags that said E3 on them.
Yeah.
And he was like, "What is this business?" And he started flipping some.
But one thing again I don't get that this doesn't make sense is what would the point be of hobbling performance? Why would they intentionally go in and make the game look the same as a console? Wouldn't they
Well,
want it to look better?
It seemed like they just ran out of time to
Right.
QA
Yeah.
the
Richard's
higher-
assertion's probably right if I had
Makes
to
a
guess.
lot more sense,
Yeah.
but it seems like they should come out and clear the air before the internet conspiracies get out of
Yeah,
control.
they're
I
already
think
in
it
full
would be awful
swing.
helpful. Yeah,
Yeah.
Be really helpful if they'd clarify. So here I can find an easy to pick up kind of motivation that I might guess at. Yeah, it's just a QA issue, that kind of stuff. My difficulty with Gameworks is I struggle to find any good motivation in supplying DLLs which put code in there which creates dismal effects like wild over tessellation. With what Ubisoft have done, I can believe that there's perfectly innocent reasons for what's gone on there. I don't have anything negative to say about them in this context. Absolutely not.
Going back to the tessellation issue, so is Nvidia leveraging its extra CUDA cores? Is that how they're able to get?
They
with
have
that?
they have higher throughput on tessellation. Yeah, we have higher throughput on compute generally, and what the inclination in that situation is where you have an advantage in one place is you try and lean on that and act as if it's the only thing that matters in a chip. And I remember the very first time I saw Mr. Peterson on a video, he was shouting about how exciting DX11 was because of tessellation and trying to get a big cheer out of the audience. It's the big deal in their architecture, and that's why they put the pressure there. Line tessellation for drawing hair, it's not a very efficient way of doing stuff. Tessellating the water in Crysis 2, spectacularly inefficient way of doing stuff that doesn't need to be done. Tessellating blocks of concrete in Crysis 2, what's the matter with these people? Over tessellating the cape on Batman's back, so it's millions of triangles. It's like it's a bit of an obsession with tessellation. And tessellation, well used, can solve loads of problems. But if you look at the efficiency of graphics cards, when you start trying to draw triangles which are made up of single pixels and things like that, the efficiency of rasterization hardware, which is what we all build these days, falls to extraordinarily low efficiencies. And that's a pretty poor use of hardware.
So do you suppose these developers simply are not aware of how the two different cards behave with AMD versus Nvidia while they're doing development? Because if it's a Gameworks game, they're probably being given Nvidia hardware, or do you think that Nvidia is encouraging them to develop with certain tessellation techniques?
Well, the trouble with these tessellation techniques is they're usually stuck inside a black box where the ISV isn't actually making a choice at all. If you get a DLL and it says, generate millions of triangles where you don't need them, that's what you're stuck with. And if you don't know how the effect is, so here's a classic. NVIDIA argue that you don't need source code in order to optimize. Yeah, and we're seeing a 6,000 line shader. You do need source code to optimize something like that. We're seeing a 6,000 line shader in Call of Duty Ghosts. And it's so inefficient on our hardware, and indeed it's significantly inefficient on NVIDIA hardware, but the ISV has no knowledge of what the algorithm is. They can't see any of the code. If it's supplied as a DLL, all you get is an effect that comes out. You get some pixels out the back, and you say to yourself, okay, these pixels are nice, but did I spend good money or bad money on them? Well, you don't know because you can't see, and they don't supply the source code in the vast majority of cases. They said since April that there is now a source license agreement, but they won't give us access to the source, and they deny us access to the source through the ISV. It's still about stopping us from getting in and understanding the algorithm and improving it. If they were serious about trying to optimize, and they say AMD can optimize, so probably they believe in optimization, yeah? If they were serious about optimization, instead of taking this wretched piece of code that does the this line tessellation for the fur on the dog in in Call of Duty Ghosts. Instead of that, they'd use something comparable to TressFX. They'd use their own optimized version of TressFX, which runs in something like 1 millisecond, when on their hardware, the implementation that they use takes about 5 milliseconds. Yeah? If they wanted to optimize, they would not choose the path they're following. It's as clear as that. They can get a furry effect. Hair and fur are fundamentally the same stuff. Though personally, I don't really know what all the fuss is about. Why are people trying to draw fur and hair everywhere?
Because you can't.
That's as a bald guy, just for anyone who's not watching the video.
I do have a question. Talking about earlier, we were talking about frame buffer size with consoles having significantly larger frame buffers, I suppose, because it's the unified memory.
Yep.
Are we going to see a move on PC graphics to also enlarge the frame buffer to much larger?
If it's 4 gigabytes, the new normal.
Is that going to be just 4 will be the new 1 gig, I guess.
4 is the new one, yeah,
Right.
and then 16 will be the new 4.
And you get to charge more for it.
Etc. Yeah, so one of the things that we're seeing as a step that's clearly going to end up on most people's desktops sometime soon is 4K gaming. You can actually get at least one laptop these days which supports 4K gaming. And when the monitor prices come down to a more acceptable level to consumers, then we will see fairly substantial adoption. And if you do the math on 4K gaming, you've got an awful lot of extra pixels, you need an awful lot of extra quality in the textures. You're really doubling up in X and Y how much stuff you've got lying around, so you're looking for 4 times as much frame buffer to solve that. And to be really blunt, 4K gaming is not the future. It's a part of the future that will last us a bunch of years. If you look at the resolution of the human eye, we go up to about 8K resolution for someone with 20/20 vision. So I think if you produce a monitor which is something like 16K across, then you beat the human eye everywhere. That's great. And that will be a place where you could finally say, okay, we don't actually need bigger frame buffers simply because we need smaller pixels.
Well, now you have panels that cost about $700 or $800 from
$650,
Samsung.
I think, the Asus.
So it's coming to the more mainstream crowd where you don't have to shell out thousands and thousands of dollars for an Ultra HD display.
But right now, it seems as though you still need about $1,000 worth of GPU to drive that many pixels, at least on a 3D game, not necessarily on the desktop.
You need a lot of horsepower, and right at the moment that's kind of the biggest amount of horsepower we can shove into a chip. But give us a couple of years, we'll do better, yeah.
When do you think 4K will be mainstream? Like mass market, I guess.
Oh, I think that prices are going to fall. One of the things we talked about earlier was how good competition is, and it's very clear that the monitor manufacturers, although they may have a slightly grubby history in some places when it comes to pricing, they are being very competitive at the moment. And the kind of stuff that was just mentioned, a $650 Asus system, congrats, yeah? Absolute applause to Asus. Now let's see someone beat it. Yeah, let's see someone produce something which is a little bit less expensive too. The quality of the gaming experience for a PC gamer is so dictated by the monitor. Yeah, let's have variable refresh rate, 4K monitors. Let's have real quality experience for everyone.
Speaking of monitors, I seem to recall that AMD had a program called Freesync to compete with Gsync, but I haven't heard much about that lately. Do you know where that's at offhand?
Yeah, luckily I do. So Freesync has been adopted as a VESA standard, which means that it's now free to adopt for monitor manufacturers, whoever they may be. No license fee to us, no license fee to VESA that I'm aware of, and quite attractively, Freesync has no additional BOM, bill of materials. It doesn't cost you any more than when you're building a monitor right at the moment. You have to build it in a slightly different way to cope with the genuinely varying frequency of refresh rate that's coming at it. But Freesync is there as a spec. We actually showed a prototype monitor at Computex. I was there a couple of weeks ago, and we showed a prototype monitor which was very, very interesting in a couple of respects. It had a fairly limited frequency range, only from 40 hertz to 60 hertz. But that will get rid of all the tearing in that 40 to 60 hertz band, which is a substantial improvement, and you could see it. What was interesting was that it was a real badged retail monitor that you can buy right now, and it had been upgraded through a BIOS update. Now, they asked us to put sticky tape over the badge, and that's fair enough because the monitor manufacturer will want to produce something better than that, and they don't want to create the impression that you can just update your monitors with BIOS upgrades. This BIOS upgrade is not something that they're, as far as I'm aware, planning to distribute into the wild. What they want to be able to do is to go through a proper QA process. So they're designing monitors and scalers. A scaler is a part of the internal of a monitor, which will cope with frequencies that go really quite low. So Freesync will let you go down to 9 hertz, and really quite high. Freesync will let you go up to 240 hertz. That's quite a substantially bigger range than at least Gsync 1.0, though I imagine they can extend Gsync and fix that. I think theirs is something like 20 to 144 hertz, but I don't know the exact numbers. Freesync is intended to cover all that range, and it covers it without any extra hardware. As I say, you can see that in the case of this 40 to 60 hertz monitor that's there. And the the way the system works means that there's no handshaking. It's a plug-and-play system. The monitor says, I can cope with this as a minimum frequency and that as a maximum frequency. GPU, obey me. And the GPU just works with it, and that's fine. It doesn't send out frames too soon and doesn't send them out any slower than 9 hertz or whatever the monitor said.
So you're saying there won't be a latency issue?
There's no additional latency from Freesync, which is really quite nice. I should also say Freesync is the code name for it at the moment, and I suspect when badged monitors come out, it probably won't be called Freesync, because when you're selling a monitor, you don't want to put the word free on it. You encourage people to think it's genuinely free.
Right.
And actually, they'll probably be marginally more expensive than the monitors are at the moment, because the panels which are used in those monitors will need to have the ability to cope with these wider range of frequencies. So, as I say, this monitor that exists at the moment can cope 40 to 60 hertz. You'll want more than that for a real Freesync monitor. But these will be available early in the new year, and you guys, if you review hardware, you may get lucky. You may get one in September or October or so. And that will be quite nice. That should be a Freesync monitor that will deliver all of the experience. Yeah, it gets rid of all of the tearing. It'll play video beautifully, so it'll lock on 24 hertz and give you exactly what you want for video playback. It'll be power efficient, and it'll be relatively inexpensive. There's no extra unit on there and no extra latency. That point you make about latency is important. The GPU talks to the monitor by saying, I have the frame, you take it now, and the monitor is required to take it. With Gsync, it's a little bit different. With Gsync, what happens is the display says, monitor, are you ready yet? And the monitor says, yeah, I'm ready yet. Do you want to send me a frame? And the GPU says, here's the frame. So there is this extra latency in there in the conversation, and the frame is actually buffered in the memory of the monitor. This is one of the reasons why the monitor is more expensive. There's physically an extra 768 meg of memory.
Oh, interesting.
And that buffers the frame, and that means that there's an extra frame of latency there. Now, who cares about 1 frame of latency? At 100 hertz, nobody cares about 1 frame of latency. At 20 hertz, everyone cares about a frame of latency.
Which kind of defeats the purpose.
Well, it gets rid of all the tearing, yeah.
Right.
So the visual quality is great, but you will have more lag. I would bet that if you put an Nvidia system which is generating its frames at the same rate against an AMD system using Freesync, that the lack of lag from Freesync will mean that games player will always have a better experience. Now, I know they'll always have a better experience because they're using AMD hardware, but that makes me sound like an advertising guy.
Yeah.
Which card would they be using?
I mean, will Freesync only work with AMD cards, I take it?
Oh, beautiful question. No, and I want to be really clear, it won't even work with all AMD cards. I want to be honest about this. So the Freesync spec is out there, and all Freesync monitors will work well with any card that wants to implement Freesync. So we will implement Freesync, and I expect other vendors to implement Freesync. Yeah, it'll be a free choice for anyone, whether they include Freesync. So Nvidia can do it, Intel can do it, anyone else can do it. After that, because there is no license fee and all this kind of stuff, then there is proper compatibility. Everything works fine. You need to do the QA when you're building the monitors and when you're building the graphics cards, but there shouldn't be any extra problems in there. What you will see is that right now, our 290 series and our 260 series completely support Freesync. So we will put out a driver sometime soon, which will allow you, obviously there's no point in having that driver until Freesync monitors arrive in the market, but it will allow you to use the 290 and the 260 series cards to work with a Freesync monitor, and you'll get all the benefits on the day you plug in your monitor. It is not the case that the remainder of AMD's discrete GPUs support Freesync. All our APUs do. So the mobile solutions that we produce and the APU solutions on desktop fully support Freesync. But things like the 280 or 270s do not. Every piece of hardware that we introduce from now on, I expect us to support Freesync. I'm not 100% certain on that, so I'm trying to put that little reservation in there. We'll make it clear when we launch each part, but I believe our commitment is that from now on, all the hardware that we introduce and thereafter sell will be totally Freesync supportive. And there are no restrictions on when Intel or Nvidia can add their support. And again, no license fee, nothing like that.
So,
they can just do
completely open source.
Completely open standard, yeah.
So but it is a hardware fix, so you will not be able to go
Correct.
Like current Intel hardware could never support it.
I don't know that that's true actually, and the reason I say that is that the spec for FreeSync is essentially derived from embedded DisplayPort, and almost all laptops are based on embedded DisplayPort. This variable refresh rate is something that they could, in principle, already have support for. I don't know. You'd need to ask them, and that's why I say actually that our APUs do this support at the moment. It's only some of our discrete cards that don't. There is an extra part that you need in the display controller that can do this smart stuff, but it isn't terribly complicated. We already own it, and we'll put it in all our future chips.
So does this does this require DisplayPort, or can it go over HDMI? Or
it requires DisplayPort 1.2a.
Okay.
Can't go over HDMI. Can't go over VGA, etc.
Okay.
I was just saying how it seems like something this would actually benefit Intel integrated graphics, since they can barely get over 20 frames a second on a lot of games.
And everything that benefits their graphics is good for the consumer trying to play on their cards. Yeah.
True. Yes. I just like making fun of integrated graphics sometimes. So.
It's very harsh of you, and I won't take sides against that company.
Speaking of displays, what do you guys think about the Oculus Rift and like virtual reality headsets and things like that? Are you guys working with them at all?
I have to say I don't actually know what our involvement is with those folks. I think it's a very interesting development, but I cannot personally make up my own mind. Like I say, I haven't discussed it inside AMD, so I'm not trying to represent AMD's opinion. I can't make up my own mind whether it's going to be great or whether it's going to be really quite lame. I'm just not sure. I think for an individual playing it, it's probably a lot of fun. Yeah, there's some value there. But I question the social value of all sticking our heads into these things. That seems a bit odd to me. But maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, I actually got a chance to speak with the Oculus founder, Paul Merlucky, and we met at PAX, and he was telling me about a future in which we'll all be using it, not just for gaming, but to interact with people socially.
Maybe so. I can't make up my mind. I don't have an opinion yet. I'll form one day, and I've got plenty of opinions on other things.
Gotcha. So it's getting pretty late. I think we'll just end on one question. This question I get asked. A decent amount, and
is it what is the world's fastest graphics card? It's not.
No, unfortunately not. Will graphics ever get to a point where it's so realistic that it's good enough and might not evolve?
Oh, okay,
because of
okay. Right, I like the tail on the question. I thought the question was going to be, will graphics get so good that it'll be the same as reality, and then we won't. We'll just finish. Graphics absolutely will get to the stage where we can do the same as reality, and I think that the first games that will convince you or leave you so you can't tell the difference between reality and real-time rendering, those first experiences will probably come in about 5 years' time. Something like that it will take. And at the moment I'd point at the PC and say that's where it'll arise. I don't think the current generation of consoles will be able to make that kind of a jump. There isn't quite the horsepower there, though they're clearly capable of doing more than you see in the first year or so from them. But I think it would be a mistake for us to stop with graphics at that point. There's an awful lot more in the imagination of games developers and designers than just reality. So I'd like to see development continue over at least another decade or so, well past my retirement, I'm quite sure. Yeah, I think there's a great future ahead. The Chinese curse is may you live in interesting times, and I've had the good fortune to live in 20 years of interesting times in 3D graphics, but I reckon there's at least another 20 years to go. Yeah.
Cool. If nobody has anything else to add.
I have a last question.
Okay.
PC graphics better than console graphics?
High-end PC graphics, no doubt about it. We put so much.
Remember, they're also in the consoles as well.
Oh, you're right. I just wanted to get that on the record.
Skipped my mind.
I'm the king of the cheap shots.
So there are some very cool things you can do with those consoles because of the extraordinarily high levels of integration that's there and the way in which all of that hardware is exposed to the games developer. But in terms of pure horsepower, there's no doubt that PC is king and will remain king for, I guess, until
forever.
Well, okay. For as long as you say it will.
And on that cheery note, I think we'll end the podcast. So thank you for listening, guys.
Guys, thank you very much for inviting me here.
Thank you for having us.
Yes. Hey, thanks for coming.
Yep.